Hey guys, today we're drawing plus size female croquis figures. If you are familiar with my channel, then you know that I have a 4-step croquis building process for any kind of fashion figure, male, female, children, front, back, side, walking, whatever, right? And so the same applies for plus size figures. Why wouldn't they? Right? So I'm going to be moving fairly quickly. If you get lost on a certain step, then I encourage you guys to go watch my previous videos on that step. And I will drop a link in the info box below. To review, the 4 steps of croquis building are these. Step 1, tracing the gesture. Step 2, building the body. Step 3, adding anatomy. Step 4, photoshopping with pencil. So quickly, let's go over the things you're going to need today. Number 1, you're going to need visual references, okay? If you follow me on Pinterest, and I have a link in my info box, I have a Pinterest board that I used to call Bodies, but I changed the name recently to Figure Drawing Refs. And I've recently added a bunch of plus size body pictures to help you guys get started finding visual references for your plus size figures. That whole board is just bodies, different bodies. And I've been adding, anatomy studies and figure poses that are good for croquis, men, women, children, and walking and yoga and dance and super skinny and super muscular and super curvy, and they're kind of all mixed up in there. So scroll through, take a look around, and I hope that helps you find some good visual references for your croquis. Find pictures that are large enough that you can print them full size on a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper and they don't end up pixelated. This one is my favorite because it is the most high res. Find pictures of figures that aren't wearing much clothing so that you can really see what the body is doing and what the body shapes look like. Look for poses where there's nothing in the way of showing off the design, like no arms crossed in front of their chests, and nothing that's too twisted or contorted to kind of ruin the effect or make it too difficult to draw a design. So these 3 are all excellent examples. You're going to need pencils and erasers. Obviously, you know me, I'm super lazy and I hate sharpening pencils. And so I use mechanical pencils all the time. Normally when I'm doing croquis work, I use a 0.3 HB pencil. This one is from Muji. But because I want to make sure the camera picks up my pencil work, just for the tutorial, I'm going to use this 0.7 B lead pencil. So I got these super skinny erasers in Japan. You'll have seen them if you watched my haul video. And I'm going to try them out for the first time now. I like to do my corrections work with a colored mechanical pencil. And my favorites so far are these Pilot Color Enos. You'll need tracing paper. You can get it in a roll. You can get it on a pad, whatever, I don't care. You're going to need a clear graph ruler. 12 inches is usually okay, but you're probably going to want something longer like this 18-inch one when you start elongating figures. And you're going to need some non-sticky tape, artist tape with a bunch of lint on it. That's what I do. There are basically 2 ways you can approach doing a plus size figure. You can take an existing croquis you have of a not plus size figure, and you can redo the step 4, which is photoshopping with pencil, right? Where you alter the body to fit the kind of customer that you want. So remember when I previously I talked about step 4, this was the step where if you wanted someone who was more hourglass, you would give her bigger breasts, bigger hips. If you wanted someone that was, more athletic, more muscular, a little bit more straight up and down and really showed that muscle definition, step 4 is where you would push the anatomy, push the bones and the muscles to create that look, right? And so similarly, this is the step where you could do that, where you take your existing croquis figure and you decide, oh, well, I'm going to add curves to this figure, and you can say, okay, I want to give her larger breasts, and they will hang lower. They will be larger overall. You know, her center front will stay the same. Her vertical proportions will stay the same, of course. And make sure whatever you do to one side, you will also do to the other side. And the angle of the hips is the same. And you should keep the crotch level still the widest part of your hips for the most part. Use your visual reference as a key for the body shapes, you know. So her waist goes in, you know, her breasts out to here. She has some curves and then a little dip in here where her underwear sits, and then curves at her high hip, another curve at her low hip. So I'm going to give her all those shapes too. And then notice at crotch level, that's about where her hips are widest. And then we taper in, and we have our knees. Our kneecaps remain the same size. You know, we're going to close up that thigh gap, but make sure you mark her crotch so you know how to draw her pants later. You know, make sure that you're staying symmetrical. Whatever you add to one side, you're going to add that same amount to the other. But keep in mind, the anatomy is not that different, okay? Remember when I was teaching you guys how to draw legs and I was saying, you know, when you draw calves, high curve on the outside, low curve on the inside, high ankle bone on the inside, low ankle bone on the outside. Those things don't change because a person gets bigger. So when I draw calves, high curve on the outside, low ankle bone, low curve on the inside, high ankle bone, right? Her clavicle will stay where it is. I'm going to give her a tiny bit more neck. I'm going to round out her face a little bit. I'm going to keep her hairstyle because I like that. And then we're going to add overall to the outside of her shoulders, arms, and there is your new figure where the pose is the same and the shapes are in the same general vein, but everything is larger, rounder, softer. She's still got that 10 head proportion because, you know, they're still models. So yeah, if you have a bunch of croquis sitting around and you don't want to do the whole 4 steps to do a plus size figure, then yeah, pull one out, put a piece of tracing paper on top, and do a new step 4 using a visual reference to help you create the shapes and proportions that you want. Alternatively, you can make one from scratch using a plus size visual reference. First, we need to find her plumb line and her center front. So it kind of got, her clavicle got kind of bleached out with the photograph. So there's the angle of her shoulders, and there's the center of her neck, the center of her breast. So her suprasternal notch is going to be about there. Her center front sits like so. That's the angle of her torso. Okay. all her weight is on this foot. She's just barely balancing on these toes. And so there's her ankle. And so I'm going to mark that as where her weight is settling. And then I'm going to connect these two to create my plumb line. I'm going to take my very not sticky tape. I'm going to tape this down. And we're going to do step 1, tracing the gesture. Trace her head, not just her face, but her whole head. And I like to mark the center of her face and her eyes to get the angle. We have her shoulders sit here. There's the angle of her shoulders. That's the angle of her neck. Her breasts are here. And as you know, if you can't see something, just pick up your tracing paper, kind of redraw that, figure out where everything sits. There are her breasts. There's her center front. There's her rib cage. You know, her elbows are right around waist level. You know, I always like to mark the widths of limbs with a full circle, not just like a little dot to mark where the elbow is, so that I can figure out how wide to make everything later much more easily. There's the angle of her hips. It's always perpendicular to center front. And we're going to do your favorite thing, pelvic boxes. I have a whole video on figuring out pelvic boxes. There's like, what's it called? Troubleshooting fashion figures, improving croquis figures. One of the two. Look, I have like almost 80 videos up. Like I cannot keep track of all the titles. This width and this width must be the same because that is the center. This angle must be perpendicular to the center front. And so we're going to create this front panel here. And then we have this. Which is the side. You know, she's twisted, so she's a 3/4 figure. We know this. She's more full frontal up here and more 3/4 here because she's twisting her torso a little bit. And we're marking that in the gesture. We've marked her knees, direction of her thigh. We mark her other knee, direction of the thigh. You know, there's her kneecap there. There's her kneecap there. So we have the direction her legs are pointing. We have this ankle and the direction of her calf and the gesture of her foot. And then the same here, there, and her foot. And now you have a complete step 1. And then at this point, you would fold the paper over, build the body, add the anatomy, you know, finesse, etc. All those good things, right? Now I'm going to show you how to do a plus size figure on a 10 head. So we have her plumb line and her center front. Whenever you do a 10 head figure, you need to measure the head. So lay this so that you're measuring the center of her head. Don't measure like this because her head is at an angle. You're measuring her head at the angle it's going. And she's at 1 1/4 inches. Take your piece of paper, mark your plumb line, and you're going to mark off 10 head measurements each at 1 1/4 inches. Number them. And then flip it over so that you could do all kinds of erasing on the top and not lose your number line. You're not going to tape down your visual reference because you're going to be scooting it back and forth as you work. As I mentioned before, the vertical proportions for a plus size figure is no different. Okay? We're really focusing on the shapes. So put that one mark right at the bottom of her chin. Make sure that your plumb lines are matched up all the time. You don't want it to start veering. If you can see 2 plumb lines, then you're changing the body as you elongate the figure. And you don't want that. You just want to elongate. Trace her head, not just her face. I get students who trace just the face and then later on their head looks really, really small because they don't have a full head there. Now, the 2 mark is going to sit not at above her breast, but kind of maybe like a quarter or a third of the way down on like where the top of a strapless dress would sit. Always make sure your plumb lines are matched up. There's the top of her breasts. And the 2 mark is here. You know, that's kind of where a strapless dress would sit. And mark your breasts. And yeah, this one is a little bit bigger because she is slightly three-quarter to us. And also because women are asymmetrical. Get over it. We have our center front. We have the angle of her shoulders, the angle of her neck. Waists are at 3. So I'm going to scooch a little bit there. So there's my rib cage in here, marking my elbows. Elbows are at 3 as well. And that's my waist. Right there. Crotches are at 4 1/4, not a 1/4 inch, but a quarter of the space. So I'm actually not moving it that much now. So we're here, we're finishing up this center front line, and then we're going to do her pelvic box. Again, the angle of her hips is 90 degrees from your center front. That's one side. This side has to be the same, so we're here. All of this is the side of her hip. And there's her pelvic box. And wrists sit right at crotch level. So we're going to mark her wrists here. Remember, wrists are different sizes. Like the top of your wrist is pretty wide and the side of your wrist is pretty skinny. And so, yeah, if you have a pose like this, you're going to have one small wrist ball and one wide wrist ball. And that's totally normal and fine. If you have a pose like this where you have a distinct weight leg, where most of your weight is on one leg, that knee is going to be at 6. There's the kneecap, there's the direction of the thigh, and then once you've marked that, then you're going to mark the other knee, wherever it may land in relation to the weight leg. There's the direction of the thigh. Oh no, I forgot the hands. At this point, you could do a couple of different things. You can mark your ankles at 8. And then you would have just a slightly elongated figure. Some people, they don't want a really distorted fashion figure. They just want something just slightly longer and more elegant, and that's fine. You can mark your ankles at 8.5, and that'll give you something much more elongated, but again, not too exaggerated. A lot of costume designers like this proportion, and I like this proportion when I'm doing younger models. Like if I'm doing like junior swimwear where I want the torso to be a bigger proportion of the body, or I want something that looks more youthful and not so leggy and sophisticated, I'll do this kind of proportion. Standard 10 head will have your ankles at 9. And so I'll mark my ankle at 9. I'm going to show you this one because it's the most difficult. And so I want to demo the most difficult thing, right? So there's the angle of your legs. Now, if she were wearing high heels, then her feet would be here and the toes would go to 10. I think I'm just going to do that because I like that. And always remember that when you're elongating your figures, your feet should also be a little bit bigger than they normally are because typically taller women have bigger feet. How's my other foot doing that? And there is your elongated step one for this figure. I'm going to mark my plumb line again. And yeah, I like to flip my drawing every time I do a step because if you watch my how to use croquis figures video, then you know that I like to use the mirror image of the pose eventually. Like, I want this pose and I want to use this pose. Okay? And if you do your croquis correctly, it will look good either direction. And so I just draw back and forth, okay? It also helps you edit. I also like to use a colored pencil for every other step because it helps me kind of separate the steps when I have all these layers of tracing paper stacked together. So, breasts in front of arms, right? Unless she's literally doing this. And so I draw the breast first. Arms go behind the breasts. Okay. I'm building this body out, copying the center front. That's the bottom of her crotch. I'm going to give her a little bit of panty line so I remember that. Oh man, I ran out of lead. Okay. Switching to the green, okay. And so I'm going to remember hips are widest at the crotch, so I just keep flaring this out. And then taper in for the thigh. I already know that that is the width of my thigh. Close that thigh gap. There's the shape of my thigh. And then there's that. That's the juncture where hip becomes thigh. So there's my second thigh. Refer back to your visual reference if you have problems. Like, notice this point is about the halfway point between crotch and knee. So there you go. Halfway point between crotch and knee is where they intersect. And then your arms. Okay. There's a tiny bit of negative space here. And yeah, sometimes these lengths get a little bit long, so I'm going to just go ahead and use my ruler here. And now I've built out my body. And let's give her some prettier anatomy shapes. Going back to my pencil. If you watch my videos on step 3, I have 2 different videos, one for upper body, one for lower body. You know, I go over muscle shapes and how that translates into body muscle shapes, even for women who don't work out very much. Because, I mean, she doesn't look very muscular, but she does follow the natural curve and anatomy shapes. Like, you can still see the curve of her brachioradialis in her forearms here and here, okay? And the high curve on the outside of her calf here, right? So those things are still the same. And so you need to pay attention to the anatomy. So again, we have our beautiful clavicle that ends right over the armpits. We have an elegant trapezius. Breasts. Front. You know, I mark the plumb line and center front at every step. Flesh out her arms, but I'm going to keep the elbows that width because I had marked that specific width, right? I'm going to give her that nice curve of her brachio and then bring it down for the wrist. And then again, we're going to curve out that deltoid. Bring it in at the elbow. Curve out for that brachio and bring in the wrist. And this wrist is wider because we're seeing the top of the wrist. And I'm drawing this arm first because it is resting in the front of her body. I do have a little bit of this negative space here. So I'm gonna bring this in a little bit. So I have that little negative space. But I'm gonna bring this out so that the arm is touching the hip. And then again, there's this tiny sliver of negative space that I'm gonna add here. A little bit here. I'm gonna give that same beautiful out, in, out shape to her legs. Hips widest at crotch level. Stop being annoying, you stupid piece of paper. Right? Knees are gonna be as wide as before. Beautiful high curve on the outside, crossing that green line before you flare back out for the ankle. That's where her kneecap sits. Flaring back out, low curve on the inside, tapering in, high ankle bone. Here we're going to address this curve, this flare of the thigh muscle, and then this part of the thigh muscle that comes out. So dipping in, flaring back out. The top of the thigh is round. There's her kneecap, so we've got a sharp little corner right there. And then again, high curve on the outside of that calf. Shins have a slight natural curve. Feel your own shin. There's a bit more flesh there than you think. Curving out, tapering inside that green line, like so. And then there's the other foot. And there is your step 3. And then step 4 is where I take my color pencil again. I flip the drawing over and I look for any errors or changes I want to make. Like these arms are totally asymmetrical. So I'm going to keep this arm because I think it's nicely proportioned with the rest of her, but I need to give her more girth here. Like that. I think her breast got a little more asymmetrical than I planned. I'm going to bring her breasts closer together a little bit. I'm going to make her head just a tiny bit bigger. Yeah, but otherwise I like her. Step 4, I would redraw the figure, adding these corrections, adding face, hair, repeating the plumb line and the center front. And also, even at this stage, you know, if you wanted to change her body, like let's say you really wanted to make her pear shape instead, I would go in and be like, okay, so let's make her breasts a little bit smaller. Let's bring her shoulders in a hair. Let's bring her rib cage in a hair. Okay. And tuck her arm in. And then let's keep her hips the same size. Right? Maybe that's the body you prefer. Maybe you want someone that's more top heavy instead. And so you keep your corrections. You keep her breasts. And then you decide you're going to make her hips and thighs more narrow. And so I'm going to bring this in here and bring this in here. I'm going to keep the width of the knees the same. Maybe make her legs, calves also a little bit smaller. So now you have this body type that you could design on. So let's recap, shall we? Number 1, the 4 steps of croquis building are the same, whether you're drawing male, female, adult, child, skinny, muscular, curvy, what have you. What you really need are good visual references that really reflect the kind of figure that you want to draw. You can take an existing croquis and change the body to fit the specifications of your customer, or you can do a complete new croquis using the 4 steps and a new visual reference that reflects the different body that you want. At the end of the day, this is what I say to my students in class, online, all the time. Look at bodies. Not in that creepy, pervy way, okay? But look at bodies. Pay attention to bodies. Pay attention to the way they move, the way they wear clothes, and their shapes. Okay? Because we need to learn how to dress bodies and draw bodies, and the only way we can do that is to study bodies. All right? So, you know the usual drill. Share, subscribe, like if you liked this video and found it helpful. If you have any questions, check the info box to see whatever stuff I have written in there. And if your answer is not there, drop me a comment below, and I will see you next time.